But now I would say that I was being verbally and emotionally abused by my piano instructor, who also gaslit me and my experience. And then when I went to the chair of the department to be like, this doesn't feel good. I'm not learning. I'm very stressed out. Received a lot of gaslighting from that person as well. I was being too sensitive. It's just how that teacher is.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation, Nicole, for a while. And ever since we talked about it, ever really since, you've been a great encourager and support for me for so many years. We've known each other for so long now. And when I was sharing about this podcast, I think you were one of the first people that got really excited for me. And we were talking about the topics that we could talk about too, in a way to highlight the need for growing leaders in not just the corporate world, but in the arts and the nonprofit world, because great leaders are needed everywhere. And you have an extensive background in arts and nonprofit management and grant writing. So you've done it all, you've seen it all. You are a leader in your own right. You've written about it, you're writing a book about it. I could go on and on, but it's not about me, it's about you. So I just want to be able to highlight and share all of the great work that you've been doing to help create really wonderful environments for people to be artistic and creative, because I know we've talked a lot about this, when people feel safe and they feel supported, they're going to give their best work. So share a little bit for the audience, because we go way back. I know I know our story, your story, but share a little bit about your background and where you come from and where you are now.
I have an undergraduate degree in dance and in piano. So I come to the arts world from a dance and music background. And when I was studying for my degree, I had an interesting experience that I think is a different experience than a lot of folks in the dance world have, is that I had in my dance community at school, including my instructors, an incredible atmosphere that really built me up and valued my creativity. And like there are certain things, like everyone, that you can't do or you don't do as well as someone else in your class. But I felt like I was really seen and valued for the things that were special about me, that I brought to the table, that I could do, and then challenged to work on the things that I couldn't do, but in a way that was like, you can do this, you can get there, work on these things, and it will make you even better at being who you are and being the artist you want to be. Whereas in my music studies, at the time, I didn't have the words to describe what I was experiencing. But now I would say that I was being verbally and emotionally abused by my piano instructor, who also gaslit me and my experience. And then when I went to the chair of the department to be like, this doesn't feel good. I'm not learning. I'm very stressed out. Received a lot of gaslighting from that person as well. I was being too sensitive. It's just how that teacher is. So I really had these two very different experiences about validating my personal creativity and my pursuits and experiencing what it's like to be in an atmosphere where you are both encouraged and challenged to create, and then being in an atmosphere where there's only one way to do, and if you don't do it perfectly, then you're not only failing this class, but you're failing as a person, you're failing as an artist. And I was having these two experiences simultaneously as a young adult, and it really shaped how I wanted to be in the world as a creator and as a teacher, because I had those very contrasting experiences of like, I really excelled in my dance creativity and found myself in dance in part because it was a place where I was validated as myself. And I can still play the piano, but I rarely do because of just the emotional that's still there 20 years later from that experience. So I kept with dance, kept with piano a little bit, but much more on the side. And dance actually led me to theater, which is how we met. And I was choreographing some theater performances as well as teaching at a dance studio and teaching at a private high school and choreographing their musicals and plays. And so that's how I got into theater was actually through dance. And that was a place where I felt like, oh, I really have something again to offer and a place where my creativity was validated because I was choreographing and it's like, yeah, bring your skills and let's work together. Usually, sometimes it was collaborative. That was great when it was collaborative. To be like, take these things and let's make something together that we couldn't have made on our own. And I really loved that about theater, about just having these people in a room that were like, we are here to make art and we're here to make something together that we can't do as one person, as one artist. And I loved that. And it was that work in theater and also in dance that led me to kind of where I am now, which is I am an intimacy director and intimacy coordinator. So I work in theater and opera and dance, but also in TV and film, choreographing scenes of simulated sex and nudity, but also emotional vulnerability and heightened physicality. And when I started intimacy profession training, that is when I was like, oh, here are the words for my experiences that I had. Here are the things that I really value about the arts and that I really value about a working environment. And it's consent and agency and autonomy and disrupting power dynamics in a way that we can all be equal and collaborate and finding those words and finding that experience. Like not only did it give me a new career path, but it changed how I did everything, how I taught, how I choreographed. I like to think that I was a pretty collaborative person earlier, but now I'm collaborative so consciously and strategically. And in dance teaching, there's a few dance education programs out there, but there's actually not a lot. And most dance teachers come to teaching just by learning how they were taught. And so they replicate that system. And I thankfully had a lot of really great dance teachers, but there's also just that tradition in dance of like the teacher and the choreographer are over everything. And so starting to disrupt those power dynamics in my teaching was really big of what can students offer? What can they bring to this space that I never would have thought of, but might be amazing and exciting. And it's going to give them more motivation and ownership in their own learning when they're able to contribute and be heard. So, intimacy profession training like changed everything for me. And I'm really excited and grateful.
I want to highlight that teachers are leaders. And when you have a really bad experience, when a teacher hasn't been taught themselves how to lead their students well, it can create that really negative experience and that toxic situation that you had to go through and now are still feeling the residual effects of with music, and that's so sad and that's so heartbreaking. I appreciate you sharing that too, because know that it can be hard to share some of those experiences, but I hope that it also highlights that we as humans are constantly learning no matter what kind of work environment, play environment that we're in. And something that you said makes me feel or think that the students that we are either responsible for teaching or training or coaching, they can have even more insight into the topic or into what they're learning because it's new and fresh and exciting. But if we create that space where it is restrictive and we're placing demands on people or not giving them a space to be heard, then it probably stifles learning as well as creativity too, would you say?
Yeah. There's two authors that I like love everything that they've written. One is Amy Edmondson, who wrote The Fearless Organization, and she coined the term psychological safety. And when we feel psychologically safe, we are able to learn because part of learning means that failure is a possibility, and we have to accept that if we're going to learn. We have to be like, "Oh, there's stuff that I'm doing for the very first time and finding out for the first time, so I'm going to fail." But if I feel like it's not safe to fail, then it's not actually safe to learn. And that's a lot of classrooms are not actually safe to learn because it's not safe to fail. And Alfie Kohn is the other author who writes a lot about pedagogy. And he wrote something very, very similar to that, but also more from like a control perspective of like if we are controlling folks, we can coerce them into completing an assignment, but that doesn't actually mean that they're passionate about the topic or even interested in the topic. They're just doing the thing. And that's not really learning. Completing a task is not really learning. And I'm much more interested in it as a teacher in what are folks learning. And even if they're learning something that I didn't anticipate, that's probably nice. That's probably good. It's probably something they needed to learn. Like, I don't need to control that, and I'm much more interested in what are people learning because it is that new perspective, those new ideas that's going to fuel their creativity. That's going to get them thinking about what else is available that I could be learning about, exploring, finding out that this thing exists, and now I want to dive deeper into that. Creativity and learning are really like kind of two sides of the same coin. Like learning the mental aspect of it, and creativity is like, now that I have this thing, what can I make with it? What can I do with it?
It makes me, think too something that I believe that everybody is creative. It might be something that we haven't tapped into as an individual or, a person hasn't had the opportunity to express. But I've heard so many people say, "Well, I'm not creative. I'm more of a science or a math type person." And I would argue that no, you are creative. You're creative in math. You're creative in science. It feels less so because we attribute creativity to something artistic in nature. But what is art? Art is creating, and you can create within any kind of field, whether you're a problem solver, whether you're a strategic thinker, whether you're using your math skills or your science skills to develop something new and fresh. And when we think about it like that, and to your point, it is that same coin, two different sides of learning. We can be creative in our learning process as long as we're in that environment where that's established and embraced. So long sort of context segue to get to the question of what does an environment look like that is very much oppressive or creating that atmosphere of a need for perfection, versus what is a really safe environment for students and teachers to work together and to collaborate.
Sima Okun has a website and a document about like the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And one of the characteristics is perfectionism. That we're always striving to be perfect instead of enjoying the process. But you can't be perfect in a process. Like a process is messy and it has no finished thing to even judge as perfect or not. And so much of creativity and learning is about that in between space of when we start and when we finish. That's where the growth is happening. So this emphasis on product, finished product, whether it's a performance or a test, is not actually facilitating learning or creativity because it's so outcome based and there's a fear of what if it's not? What if it's not perfect? What if it's not an A? Then what happens? And so we're constantly striving after perfection instead of striving after what can I learn from this? What could I create in this or from this? And then this idea of like the teacher as the fount of all knowledge, or in the arts world, like a choreographer or director being the only voice in the room and the only person who has the right answer. And then the students and the actors and dancers have to like guess what that is or work really hard to make that be true. whether or not they think it's the right answer. And so a collaborative space is one where everybody's point of view gets to be heard. And that doesn't mean that there's not responsibilities. And this is something we talk about a lot when I teach workshops on power dynamics in the arts is like there's always this concern of like, but as the director, it's my job. And I'm like, yeah. That means you hold the ultimate responsibility of making sure the show's ready to open at this date and the ultimate responsibility of making sure everybody's in the same show. So sometimes they are not. Sometimes the actors are in different shows. But that doesn't mean other people can't be involved in the process and have their voices and choices heard throughout. And I always give this very silly example of like, if you are coming to my house for breakfast and I say, like, I'm gonna make scrambled eggs and I'm gonna make biscuits and I'm gonna make whatever. And you say, oh my gosh, I love ketchup on my scrambled egg. I do not love ketchup on my scrambled egg. But you have stated something about your breakfast process that will make you happy. And it's easy for me to meet that need. I can go buy a bottle of ketchup. And there's nothing about you having ketchup that means that I have to have it. I can still have hot sauce on my eggs, but I have upheld your point of view as valid for you and equal to mine. I didn't make fun of you for wanting ketchup. It's just like, oh, okay, not my choice, but that doesn't mean that I can't meet that need or hear that out. And it doesn't ultimately make any impact on our breakfast, except maybe make it more pleasant because you felt heard and validated in your desire to have ketchup at the breakfast table, and we did. So I think it's very often we think of collaboration as like this person gets this and this person gets this. And sometimes it is, but also sometimes collaboration means everybody gets to be heard and have their needs met or at least have their needs validated. Even if ultimately we're like, that's a super cool idea that you think that this Romeo and Juliet should be happening on the moon, but that's actually not the version that we all have agreed to do. I think that's super creative, and I think we should save them for another time, right? Like, I can validate people's ideas, and I can hear them out, and I can value them, and that's part of collaboration too. Even if ultimately as the director, I'm the one that has to make the choice and say, "Here's what we're doing," because that is part of my responsibility, and that's not me being authoritarian, that's me saying, "This is my responsibility as the director to make sure that we're together." And maybe I can pull some of this idea and that idea, and maybe I can't. But ultimately, I'm saying these things to make us all look good. Because if you're on the moon and you're in 15th century Verona or whatever, like we are not going to look good. We're going to look a mess. We're not going to look good. And that's where it's coming from. I'm coming from holding everybody and wanting everybody to make the best art look the best that they can. And when it comes from that place, that's collaboration. When it's really about how do we do the best work we can do so everybody looks good and everybody feels good in the process.
Those are amazing examples, and I think you and I have probably seen production. It's where the left side of the stage doesn't know what the right side is doing or the costumes and the set.
I think we've been in some of those.
Yeah, uh, and it in the context of theater especially, makes me think back to some really wonderful experiences where I had directors who would say, "I have an idea. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, then we'll find another avenue or route." Or, "Hey, love your idea. Let's try it. And if it doesn't work, then at least we've tried it together and we've seen if we can fit it into the fabric of the story." Because to your point, there needs to be that other outside person. They're the third eye that can see the whole picture, the big picture, and help with the details too. and they have to be the one to help shape and structure it to make sure that everybody is aligned. And the best experiences that I've been a part of have been those where the director will come to that first table read and say, "Hey, this is what I'm thinking. I'm not sure about this here. I have some thoughts on how we might approach it. Here's our overarching goal and the vision that I have for this production as the leader. And I'm excited what we're going to explore together and what we're going to make together. And I want to hear all your voices and your thoughts. And we're going to play and have fun. And there is room for that messiness that you talked about in the process, and the end result will be something that has that shape and that structure to it to present and share with other people. But you have to come to that with the humility of, I don't know what we're necessarily going to find, and we might find something completely different. To your point, it still has to be aligned though, so that we're not on the moon and also trying to float through a canal in Venice or you. Yeah.
Yeah, my favorite phrase, whether I'm directing or choreographing or intimacy directing, like, my favorite thing to say is, "Let's find out." Somebody will be like, "Oh, could we do this?" I'm like, "Let's find out." You know, sometimes we got 5 minutes to find out, sometimes we've got a whole hour we can spend finding out, but, like, we can find out. And when we find out, like, it could go either way. It might be great. It might be the worst thing we ever saw. But we don't know if we don't try it. So, like, let's find out. And performers do their best work when they feel confident. And they feel confident in a process that they believe in and that they can trust the other people on stage with them, that they can trust that the director put them out there to succeed and not to fail. Your trust leads to confidence. And it's the same thing in intimacy. You know, intimate scenes, we have to be confident in performing them if those are going to look good. And collaboration and trust are just so key to building confidence, which really is ultimately what we want as a leader, whether it's teacher or director or choreographer. Like, we want the people that work with us to be confident when they go out to do the thing, because that's how we all do our jobs. That's how we all succeed at our job.
Oh, yeah. Otherwise, I think of that. I had a really great professor, playwriting professor, amongst other things that he taught too. And he would talk about doubt. And there's like the little d doubt and then the big D doubt. And both of them can be a problem. But I remember that big D doubt being the one that can really stifle that confidence and put us in a state where, in how I view it, we are so self-conscious because we don't have the confidence in what we're doing, and it prevents us from actually being present and being responsive and reactive because, my philosophy on acting is really about being present, being in the moment, and being able to respond to the other person. You might be the one that's instigating something in the scene, in the storyline, but how are you really listening to the other person and being ready to respond? And if we're only listening to that big D doubt in our minds,
Mm,
then we're not able to listen to anybody else.
yeah.
It's also about, it also makes me think it's about the self-awareness too, and you have to have just enough to know how you're being perceived, and then you have to eliminate the rest, so you're not consciously looking at yourself and, like, "How am I me in this space too?"
Yeah, it's hard to be a performer because your brain is always operating on 2 levels of, like, your character self and what they have to do and respond to, and then your actor self of, like, "And then I cross over here," and like, that's a lot.
It is a lot, and that's why, I love that you've taken the path of intimacy director. I started hearing about the profession growing, I wanna say 8 years ago. It might have been around that time. And I thought about it recently too in the context of this podcast and just leadership in general, and how theater, the arts, there isn't really a strong HR presence in the sense that, there isn't always someone designated and ultimately accountable or responsible for the safety and comfort of a performer in those sensitive and delicate moments. And I say that with the caveat, yeah, well, I know that you have stage manager and director and union rep, but at the same time, those folks who are in those positions might not actually be trained or have the wherewithal to know what to look for and how to create those safe spaces. And that's also coming from my own experience and knowing what it's like as a performer to not always feel as comfortable with a moment or to have to ask to talk through something that might be really delicate and cross a boundary if we don't figure out how are we approaching this moment and this story. So, what's the history of intimacy directors, and what's sort of been your journey in that as you've been growing as a leader in that space?
Yeah, the intimacy direction field as a field is really new. 2017 was kind of like the first time that it was publicly discussed, and like 2018 was the first time that someone had a credit as an intimacy director and intimacy coordinator. And it was Tony Sina at Stratford Shakes as the first intimacy director on the Buckeye, which was 2017, I think. And then Alicia Rodas at HBO as the intimacy coordinator of The Deuce in 2018. So this is still a super, super new field. But what isn't new is intimacy in performance. Like, we have been having intimacy in performance for as long as there's been more than one performer on stage. So we have always directed intimacy for better or for worse. When it comes to theater, film, and television, like, we've had intimacy on stages and screens for far, far longer than this position has existed. And some folks are very competent at directing those themes, and some folks should not do that. But this field came out of two things. One was, okay, we have all of these ways of speaking to performers where we craft every moment. We choreograph dances, we choreograph fights. Those are both heightened physicalities, intense physicalities that have a lot going on. We create blocking that supports the story. We're like, "Oh, do you know that you're doing that weird thing with your hand?" "No." "Okay, you're doing a weird thing with your hand. Don't do that. It's distracting from the story." Right? Or, "Actually, the cross is stronger at this moment because you've just said you want to leave and now you're getting closer to the door," or whatever. And we're looking at movement from a storytelling standpoint and that. So there's that side of it of like, why are these intimate moments that have a lot of physicality that can be complex and ideally is part of the story? Why are these moments not being treated with the same kind of professionalism as a dance or a fight or even just regular walking? These are being treated with far less professionalism when we're like, just go for it. Or when we refuse to even do it, which is definitely some directors that I have worked with in the past where they refuse to even talk about the fact that there's a kid. And you're like, I guess someday we'll do this, then find out how it works. So there's like kind of the movement side of it. And
Yeah.
then the other thing was just the weird power dynamic side of it, right? If your director's not going to talk about it, how are you going to talk about it? And what if you have questions? What if you have boundaries? What if you have concerns? If they're not talking about it, that makes it really hard for you to talk about it. And this happens more in film than in theater, but or did certainly not only is just this idea of like, now that we're in the take, just take your shirt off. It'll be fine. It'll be so great. Can't you just get naked? Uh, no. And it's really hard to say no in those moments
Yeah.
where you're already doing a thing and you feel like if you say no, you will stop the process. You will break the trust of this relationship that maybe has been going really well, or that you want to be a relationship in the future because you would like to get hired again by this person or this place. And so by having an intimacy professional as a third party, it helps break that up of like, we can express our concerns because here's a person who talks about I had a conversation yesterday for like 2 hours about this film that I'm working on in February that some of the words that I had to say in that conversation, I have never said in my whole life until that. And some of the things the director was saying back to me and like the producer sitting there with us on Zoom, like, I can't believe you all are just talking about this. Like it's I'm really well, this is the job. We have to be able to talk about it. And if I can't talk about it, how are they? There's gives actors the space to come up with their questions and their concerns and just say, I don't think I actually want to do that. Or, yeah, it's totally fine. Whatever. And it also, as part of the position, means that there's not just one voice of what a scene looks like of intimacy. There's not one way of telling a story ever, but sometimes we can get stuck in the view that we have of like, oh, it'll look like this. But when it ends up being my job to choreograph, then it doesn't have to look like any particular thing. It has to look like choreography that upholds the actor's boundaries. And between my ideas and the director's ideas and the actor's ideas, we're gonna come up with the thing that works, which is probably better than when it was just my idea to start with. The 4 creative brains are usually better than 1. And I think this goes for every artistic specialty, but also just, like, thinking about working in teams in general. I work with a director here in Florida that I've worked with him for 5 years. I've worked with him as a director, um, and I've worked with him as an actor that I've choreographed, and he is about to direct me for the first time as an actor, in the spring, which is exciting. So we've gone through a lot of facets of this relationship, but he says quite often in, like, day 1 meetings between cast and designers and everybody, like, "I've hired the best people. I've hired the smartest people. I've hired the most creative people." Because I don't want all that. Like, I know I don't have all that, and I don't want all that responsibility. Why would I think I am the best and the smartest at everything when I can go out and hire these people, and I know when I put these people in a room with me and with you, that what we get together is going to be something that we didn't even know we could do when it was just one of us. And I always love hearing that from a leader, from somebody who's running the room of being like, "No, I brought in all these brains and creativities and leadership qualities and talents on purpose because I want that. I'm not threatened by that. I know we're all going to be better when we work together." That's how I love to work as an intimacy professional. And, the job has been around for now almost 10 years, but not quite. And there are still people that feel threatened by the position, feel threatened by not being able to do exactly the thing that they want to do, uh, or fearful. They feel fearful that it won't be as good because it's not how they anticipated that it would be, or that having this third party in between the directors and the actors might break the trust rather than make it easier to facilitate and hold. So there's still some fear, there's still some pushback, but there's also a lot of people who are really excited that there's someone making the process of intimacy more professional, that there's someone who's helping us talk about it in a way that's professional and clear and not I mean, it's always weird. It's weird to talk about, but that's not precious or awkward. And it comes down to that idea of, like, confidence. We have to know that what we're doing and be able to feel confident in it and go out and do that thing. So, that's kind of the history of it and my history of working, I guess.
There are so many things in that I wanna highlight, and one of them is, well, you just mentioned people being afraid of working with an intimacy coordinator director. And at the same time, from my own perspective, then I've been a director and an actor, but specifically from my acting perspective, if you don't broach the conversation and you just wing it and say, well, we'll get to it when we get to it, that creates a lot of anxiety in your performers because they don't know when you're just going to get to it. And there's no deadline, there's no time frame, there's no you don't know how if you don't know how we're gonna get to this, then I have less confidence that I'm gonna be safe in this situation, and I also want my scene partner to feel safe too. It's not just about me, but it's the 2 of us, which also brings to mind too, sometimes I have felt that theater is seen as less than a business, but it is a business, and one of the bigger differentiators is that we are using our physical bodies for something that is representing a character, but it's still us. And that's where we do need that care and we do need those boundaries. And you've been mentioning that word. I want to unpack what that can look like for us too, because um, you can say to yourself, well, the words that I'm saying, they're not me. I am not Lady Macbeth trying to manipulate my husband and those around me for power and control or what have you. But what you cannot do is take back an intimate moment that you have had with someone that in real life you would not intend to ever have with that person. You can't take that back, and you can't take the feeling of that back, and you certainly can't take any of the trauma that might come from a really, inappropriate type of intimacy on stage that could have been avoided. And so I wanna highlight that from that other perspective too, because theater and acting and dance, it's all still as creative as it is still a business. And so for people to not believe that there should be boundaries like there should also be in business is a little it's still a little bizarre to me. But I want to chat about boundaries because they're incredibly important. They're there for a reason. I want to hear, what your perspective is and why boundaries are important and how can we start to establish and advocate for them.
I had a conversation with some folks at Actors Equity a few months ago, and we were talking about boundaries. And one of them said, I like to think about boundaries as preventive care. And I was like, oh, I kind of like that analogy of like, yeah, you go to the doctor when you don't feel sick because you want to make sure everything is what it is and you have a good baseline so that when something does go wrong, we know that it's wrong. We're like, "Oh, that doesn't feel like that. I guess I should go to the doctor again and find out." So the boundaries are kind of preventive care. They're my baseline. They're how I know where I'm at. My friend Nigel Fulton teaches intimacy and is an intimacy and fight director in Australia, and he talks about boundaries like a fork in the road. We know we're going somewhere. We know we've got this thing that we have to work on, but we've reached this decision point, and like we could go about it this way or we could go about it that way. But we should probably talk about it because if we don't talk about it, what if we change different paths? Then we're no longer on this same journey. And I think that's also a really helpful way of thinking about boundaries. It's like a time we need to stop and talk about how we go forward. Because some of the unhelpful ways I think we talk about boundaries are like walls and fences that keep people out. And that's not really helpful to me in terms of a working relationship. Of somebody that, like, I need to be able to do this scene for the next 4 weeks, 4 performances a week, or 8 performances a week, or I need to be at least be able to do it for the next 3 or 4 takes. If I need to have a working relationship with a person, like, blocking them out is probably not the way to go. Not to say that there are not times where that's true. But I like this idea of, like, we've gotta stop and have a conversation. We've gotta figure out our way forward when we come to a boundary. And I think performers in particular, boundaries are much more nuanced than we talk about. In life, we kind of talk about like, oh, we have different boundaries, right? I have different boundaries with my parents than I do with my partner, and different boundaries with my students than I do with my colleagues. But for performers, boundaries are very often talked about as don't touch my whatever. Or it's about the body because our body is part of our employment. As you brought up, is like one of those confusing parts of our employment is that our body is totally involved in it. But boundaries are actually so much more nuanced than that. Like we can have content boundaries around like actually the story isn't appropriate for me to tell because of my experience or my past harms or the body that I'm in or whatever. Or I don't like how I feel when I'm telling stories about this. Totally fine. There is content that you might not want to be a part of. Or actually, this character on stage does this action, or this character is described as this, and I don't want to do that. And this comes up a lot, particularly for queer actors and actors of color when they're portraying characters that are maybe stereotypes or tropes. Maybe that's the boundary to not promote that stereotype or trope by accepting that job. That could be a boundary around content. Be like, yeah, it's an interesting play. I'm right for this role and I don't agree. That's that's a boundary. We might have boundaries around the context, and this is one that changes so much for performers in particular. Like the things that I'm willing to do on day one with someone that I've never met before are not the same things that I'm willing to do 4 weeks later after we've had a whole rehearsal process. Right? I might feel way more interested in being lifted or kissing or whatever 4 weeks later after I know this human. Maybe I just need to build some trust. There's also a difference in performing a scene of nudity in like a black box theater where you can feel the audience breathing on you versus a like 3,000 seat Broadway house. It's a different experience. And some people are going to feel very differently about those situations. It's just the context that we're in can affect our boundaries and maybe find new boundaries that we didn't know we had. And so we were in that context. And then there's all the ones around our body. Like, I don't want to be touched here. I don't want to be touched a certain way. Or also things I don't want my body to do. Like, I am now an old dancer. I can still do a split. I will not. I am not interested in the pre work and post work that will require for that one moment in a performance. Not as just a thing. And I'm like, could I? Sure. Will I? No. Yeah, and I think those are that's another way to think about boundaries, like, just because you can doesn't mean you should or you want to, and that's okay, and that's okay. So I think there's a lot of different things around boundaries, and even I used to teach, body Lord, somatics, like body awareness to musicians, master's degree music students, and we would talk about boundaries, and they would almost every single time this came up, they would be like, "But we're musicians. It's just us and our instrument. I don't have any boundaries." I was like, "Really? You don't need your music at least 2 weeks ahead of a gig to be able to feel confident in your performance? You don't need a break after every 80 or 90 minutes of rehearsal? Like, really?" Everybody does have boundaries. We just haven't always thought about them as a boundary. So I gave you some other definitions that colleagues have, but I talk about boundaries as a need that I have to have met in order to do my best work. And if that need doesn't get met, I might not do my best work. I might still do the work, but I'm not going to be my best. Or I might not do the work. Like there are two kind of different outcomes of that, but that's how I define a boundary personally. It's like a need that I have met to do my best work. And not all of our needs can get met, and then there's that conversation of, like, is this still something I want to do? So, I try to use the word "need" also for boundaries because not everyone does feel like they have boundaries or that they're allowed to have boundaries. And this comes up a little bit more with dancers than with actors because the body is even more a part of dance, like, no voice, no thoughts, just body, just do the thing. Right, so dancers are allowed to have needs because we can say like, "Oh, that's not feeling great on my ankle today. I don't wanna do petite allegro. I don't wanna jump," or, you know, "My back is a little wonky. I need to not do that lift today." So dancers are used to having a body-based need So I also use that word need to kind of short circuit some of our I don't have any boundaries reflex.
Well, I love that you highlight the difference that we think about boundaries typically as a negative thing, as I'm shutting you or others out versus this is about how I need to be set up for success, and it's so much more positive, and, you mentioned the word context a lot, and I think of context I think of transparency as context, referring back to a quote from Simon Sinek, who shares that being transparent is about providing the context, and so I see that as really important for anyone who is in casting or auditioning someone or the director sharing upfront what the performance is going to require, definitely gonna require, or what it might change into. Because you and I have been in situations, or I've heard of plenty of other people in situations where the thing you have been cast in has changed, and now there are more demands put on you, and no matter what, you now feel like you are in a corner because you feel the pressure to now perform in this certain way that you didn't anticipate or expect, and not having someone in your corner to be able to help you navigate that and to help you with your needs or you know navigate just the communication around that is incredibly challenging. And that's why, I like that you say you don't have to accept every job. We feel the pressure because it's our livelihood, and we might feel like if we turn something down, then it's going to prevent us from getting the next thing and the next thing and the next bigger thing. But at the same time, if it goes against your values and what you are comfortable and confident in, then you're not going to have a good time. You're not going to perform your best. And it could end up doing serious damage to you as an individual
Yeah.
down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. Boundaries are also I have a shirt. I think I wore it yesterday though. This is like boundaries are self-care. Like boundaries are a way that we take care of ourselves and tell people how we expect to be treated. And I think it's another way of thinking about them is like this is boundaries are how I set myself up for safety.
Yeah. It makes me also think too the word consent, and you talk a lot about consent, especially in dance too. What is a what does consent-based practice look like for anyone in any kind of profession? I feel like there has to be some level of that, right?
Yeah, I think there's it's that idea of like we could be top down and it's my way and that's the only way, but that's not actually enabling consent because nobody gets a choice when they're given an order. So there when we give people choices, they are, like we were talking about before, likely more motivated and invested in doing the thing because they've had some choice. And especially when it comes to the people that are doing the work, if they're doing the work every day, they probably have a very different perspective on it than the person who's slightly removed. If the actor actually has a different perspective on their character than the director does because the actor is living into it with their physical body all the time. And their focus is only on that character, while the director's trying to look at all of them. And it's the same thing when we're looking at like managers and people or teachers and students. Like the people doing the work of putting the widgets in the boxes every day or trying to learn the stuff have a very different perspective on what it's like to put a widget in a box or what it's like to try and receive this material and understand it than the manager who just watches them put the widgets in the box and make sure that it's needing however many widgets for the day or whatever, or the teacher who already knows the material and so they can teach it. Like, it's a totally different perspective. And when you're living something every day, you are invested in finding out like what's the most efficient way to do this? What's the healthiest way to do this? What's the most enjoyable way to do this? Those are questions that only those workers and only those students and only those actors actually have the answers to. Everybody else is a step removed. So what can I learn from those people's actually lived experience that's going to make them happier, healthier? invested in their work, excited to be at work, feel ownership over their bodies at work, and probably going to make our final product, whatever that is, much better, or our bottom line healthier because all of our people are healthier. So consent for me is about, have we mitigated the power dynamics as much as possible? Doesn't mean we don't have titles, doesn't mean we don't have responsibilities, does mean we're super transparent about those things, right? Where the director is like, yeah, but we're not all in the same play right now. We all need to get on the moon or whatever. Like they're transparent about what their responsibilities are and what they need to do in a timely fashion to make that be true. The teacher is like, yeah, I'm the teacher. I know we have to do these things. We said this course is gonna have these outcomes, so this is what I'm obliged to. I my final grades have to be turned in by this date. This is what I'm obliged to. So we're transparent about all of the powers that go into it, and it's an ongoing process. There's going to be dialogue, there's going to be shifts and changes. The context is gonna change, which is gonna change everybody's boundaries and needs around that because it's going to take us time to get from A to B. So I'm going to be transparent about what all of our roles are on this journey and that it's going to shift and change. And we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep talking about it. And we're going to keep talking about it until we get to the end. And to me, that's really what consent is. It's just this active process of talking to people and treating them like humans who care about their bodies and their work in the same amount that I care about my body and my work.
But I like that you brought up the power balance and dynamic because, um, the best leaders are the ones that roll up their sleeves and do the exploratory work to learn about your experience so that they can craft a better situation versus something that you were mentioning even earlier too, the idea that I'm coming in as the authority in my field and I'm the expert dance instructor or brilliant director or teacher or in business world, I'm a lauded leader in X, Y, or Z widget manufacturing, right? And I'm coming in with this reputation and this authority, and I'm just going to point my finger or say a word, and this is what you all need to do when, yes, you have put in the reps and you've developed that experience and you've got a wealth of wisdom, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't listen to the situation and the people who are maybe going through challenges or trying to figure out how to be their best creative selves or using their body in a way to tell a story. If you don't hear from them and lean on their experience, which is expertise, then you're not going to be able to move forward in a healthy way.
Yeah. I say to students always on like the first day of class, like, I'm an expert in the subject matter, and that is why I'm here to teach it. And mainly, I'm an expert in the subject matter because I put in the time to study it. And also, I'm 20 years older than you, so I've had that time. But you are experts in your bodies, in your past experiences, and you are the experts in how you are receiving this material that I'm asking you to learn. And I need you to bring that expertise all the time because if you're not telling me how you're receiving the material and if you're learning, then what are we doing here? Like, we're in class. That's what we should be doing. So I need to know that to be able to continue to do my job. And everybody else in this space has a different body and background that they're bringing to this. So they need your expertise as well as mine. They need to hear what this is like for your body and your experience and the things that this means to you. And you need to hear what it's like for them and their body with their experience and their meaning making. Like, we actually need everybody to be experts because that's how we're going to get the most out of our time together.
And that power imbalance comes when we don't see the people that we're working with as experts or experienced, and we don't give them that room for a voice. And it's so right, it's so important, and I know it's gonna take work, but if you were to ask people or challenge people with one thought or idea, whether they're a teacher, a manager, a boss, a leader, a director, a dance choreographer, anyone, all of us, right? Because to your point, to many points that we made in other episodes too, you don't have to have a title to be a leader. We have titles that tell us who's accountable, who's responsible, who cares for what, who's supporting what. But we can all be leaders and we can all be advocates for better, safer working environments. So, what would you challenge everybody to go out and do and be to make those safe spaces?
Assume best intention. I think is one, like, that's not something for me to when I'm teaching. It's like, I'm assuming everybody's there to learn. I'm assuming everybody's there to create. I'm assuming everybody's there to work. I am not assuming people are there to screw around, just get a paycheck, see somebody else. Like, I'm assuming that we're all there to do the work. And I always start from that place of like, I'm assuming everybody's best intention and that we're all here for the same reason. And then having the conversations and having the hard conversations. I think you and I have talked about this before. Um, that if you can't have a hard conversation, you might not be ready to be in a leadership position. And whether that hard conversation is like being able to talk about sex without getting flustered, or if that hard conversation is about someone's academic performance or their job performance or about how they're treating other people at work. We, we have to be able to have those hard conversations and have them in ways that are compassionate and respectful and recognizing the humanity of that other person. But being a leader does not mean that I get my way, that I get my way all the time, or that it's easy for me because I'm the leader. And so I just get to say, like, do this. They, I have a really hard job as a leader, and most of that comes down to making sure other people have safety to do their job.
Nicole, I love what you're doing. I have always loved what you're doing, that you're able to be a champion for others and help others create in the best types of environments and give their best selves. You are doing even more great work in the form of a book and, of course, all of your directing and choreography. But I know your book is coming out sooner than later, or you're wrapping it up. But do you wanna share a little bit about it or how you want people to reach out to you and connect?
Book is coming probably about a year from now. So we're recording this in December of 2024. Hopefully, either very late 2025 or very early 2026, there will be a book that is meant specifically for dance and movement teachers about creating pedagogy and classroom and rehearsal spaces that are consent forward, trauma informed, and psychologically safe. So I am done. I have done my work. I have done the writing. So there's still a few more steps to be had. But it is definitely coming, and I'm very excited about just getting this out there and getting more people the tools to do really good things, things that make us feel safe and excited to be at work and like humans when we're learning. My website is my name. It's NicolePerry.org. So you can find blog posts and events and a contact form for me. And then the other website is momentumstage.org. And that is a nonprofit that I run that specializes in professional development opportunities for specifically dance and theater teachers and artists. But it's very helpful, I think, for lots of people who are interested in the arts or students of the arts. And if you liked what I had to say about boundaries today, there is a discount code that I use. It's DT Pod. So for being on a podcast, and it's 25% off our boundary worksheet. So the things that I was talking about today about context-based boundary is a choreographic boundary. There's a worksheet for that on our website. So you can check that out if you want to spend some more time figuring out your boundaries.
I love that. We'll make sure we have that listed in the comments captions too, so people can grab that discount code and go to the link. Nicole, I know we'll probably be back. We have so much more to talk about. When your book comes out, I'd love to have you back because this has just been fabulous. I know we could dive even deeper, and we will at some point. But I hope that everybody can take something from this conversation because while we're talking a lot about the arts and dance and theater world, there's a lot that I have taken from that experience into more of the business setting that still applies because I think to our mutual point, you're still at a job, you're still at work. And so, how can we create those really wonderful, safe places where people can be their most collaborative and healthy selves? So, thank you so much for being a guest. Thank you all for listening. And we'll talk to you soon, Nicole. But for everyone else, tune in for the next episode. And until then, thank you again.